Marvin had stopped believing in miracles the day he buried his wife beneath a grey sky, clutching her favorite scarf, as rain poured like sorrow from the heavens. His mornings blurred into empty rituals, the same coffee cup, the same silent house, the same echoing steps that seemed too loud in rooms meant for two. Neighbors passed him by with polite smiles, not knowing the storms raging inside him, nor the loneliness wrapped around his bones like ice. Every afternoon he found himself on the same park bench, watching pigeons peck crumbs and leaves swirl in forgotten corners. The world felt colorless, washed out like an old photograph, with nothing left to surprise him, till the sound of screeching tires shattered the silence, slicing through the day like a scream. Marvin's eyes darted up, just in time to see a small shape hurled from a speeding car, tumbling wildly through the air. A flash of white fur spun against the sunlight, a silent cry trapped in the chaos. Marvin's breath caught in his throat as his body moved before his mind could think. How could someone toss a living soul out into the world like garbage? You won't believe how this story unfolds. It's a journey that will break your heart, then stitch it back together in ways you never imagined, touching even the hardest hearts who've long stopped believing in second chances. Marvin lunged forward, arms reaching out, heart pounding so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. Time seemed frozen, each second stretching into an eternity of possibility and dread. He felt gravel crunch under his shoes as he dove toward the falling bundle of fur. In one desperate motion, his hands closed around a trembling, weightless body. The impact sent him crashing to the pavement, pain shooting through his hip and shoulder. But all he cared about was the tiny creature pressed against his chest, so fragile and shivering. Two enormous blue eyes stared up at him, wet and terrified, glinting like shards of broken glass. He could feel its rapid heartbeat fluttering against his ribs like a frightened bird. Blood smeared his shirt where a wound leaked scarlet into soft white fur. Could he possibly save this little life, when he'd already failed to save so much in his own? Marvin tried to sit up, grimacing as pain radiated through old bones. The kitten mewled a thin, raspy sound that made his chest squeeze tight with sorrow. People around him gasped, gathering closer, murmuring in shock and pity. Somebody shouted to call the police or animal control, voices echoing off brick walls. Marvin cradled the kitten tighter, as though any gap might let it slip away. He studied the blood soaking into his shirt, hot and bright against pale fur. A memory flashed of his wife cradling a stray tabby years ago, her laughter soft as summer rain. He blinked away tears, feeling raw and exposed under so many eyes. Could this tiny creature be a sign, a reason to keep going when he'd nearly given up? Or would this be one more heartbreak he wasn't sure he could survive? Marvin forced himself to his feet, clutching the kitten so close he could feel its shivering breath. People tried to help him, but he shook them off, eyes locked on the trembling animal. The kitten let out another weak cry, so small it seemed to vanish into the wind. Marvin felt something inside him crack open, like a door letting in light after years of darkness. He didn't know who had thrown the kitten or why, and a part of him raged at the cruelty of it all, but in that moment, he knew one truth as clear as his own name. He could not leave this creature to die, not when it had fought so hard to land in his arms. Tears spilled unchecked down his cheeks, streaking his weathered face. He looked around at the people watching him, as if daring them to challenge his choice. But how could he explain to anyone that this tiny cat felt like the first reason to breathe again? Marvin started walking, ignoring the pain screaming in his joints with every step. Cars honked angrily as he crossed the street, barely aware of the city around him. He held the kitten close, whispering gentle words he hadn't spoken to anyone in years. He didn't know where he was going yet, only that he couldn't stop. Each breath was ragged, half sobs and half determination. The kitten stirred weakly, pressing its nose into his chest as if seeking comfort. People stared as he passed, their faces a blur of shock and curiosity. Marvin felt exposed and terrified, yet strangely alive in a way he hadn't in so long. He glanced down at the kitten, eyes glistening with tears. Would this tiny creature become his salvation, or his next heartbreak? Marvin pushed open the clinic door with his shoulder, the bell jangling like an alarm in the quiet room, his heart thudding so loudly he could barely hear himself think. The place smelled of disinfectant, rubber gloves, and the faint sweetness of animal shampoo, a sharp contrast to the cold air outside. A young receptionist glanced up, her eyes widening at the sight of Marvin's blood-stained shirt and the trembling kitten clutched to his chest. Marvin tried to speak, but his voice cracked like brittle paper as he croaked out the words, "Help him, please." The receptionist jumped into action, calling for the vet in a voice that trembled with urgency. Marvin stumbled to the counter, legs weak, as though the adrenaline that had fueled him was draining away all at once. He leaned heavily against the edge, feeling every one of his 68 years pressing down on his shoulders. The kitten let out a thin, pitiful mew that made a woman waiting with a small dog cover her mouth in horror. Marvin blinked back tears, trying to keep his vision clear, willing himself not to collapse right there on the linoleum. Could this tiny scrap of life possibly survive the cruelty it had endured? Dr. Lillian Perez, a woman with kind eyes and dark hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, rushed out from the back, her expression shifting instantly from surprise to focus. She reached for the kitten with gentle hands, murmuring soft words in a soothing voice as she inspected the blood-soaked fur. Marvin hesitated, unwilling to let go, his arms tightening around the kitten despite the vet's calming reassurances. Dr. Perez spoke gently, telling him the kitten needed immediate care and promised she would do everything in her power. Marvin felt his arms trembling as he finally released the kitten into her capable hands, the sudden emptiness making his chest feel hollow. He watched Dr. Perez vanish through swinging doors, his eyes fixed on the swish of her blue scrubs. A hush fell over the waiting room, as though everyone there held their breath alongside him. Marvin sank into a chair, staring blankly at the floor tiles, each speckled square spinning in his vision. A woman nearby whispered, "Bless you," but Marvin barely heard her through the roar of fear in his ears. Could he stand to watch another life slip away when he'd already lost so much? Minutes crawled by like hours as Marvin sat hunched over, elbows on his knees, gripping his cap so tightly his knuckles turned white. A clock ticked on the wall, its second hand a relentless reminder that time could run out at any moment. Children's laughter floated faintly from outside the clinic windows, a cruel contrast to the weight of worry pressing on his chest. Marvin thought about how his wife used to say every creature deserved a chance, no matter how small. He wondered if this was her way of sending him a message from wherever she might be. Yet doubt coiled in his stomach, whispering that he was just an old man trying to fill an emptiness too big to fix. The door behind the counter swung open again, but it was only a tech bringing out a chart for another patient. Marvin tried to swallow, but his throat felt like it was filled with gravel. He closed his eyes and prayed silently for the first time in years, not sure if anyone was listening. Could he bear the heartbreak if the kitten didn't make it through the night? Dr. Perez finally returned, peeling off her gloves, her eyes kind but shadowed with concern. She crouched beside Marvin's chair, speaking low so the others couldn't hear. The kitten had deep bruising and a nasty cut on one leg, but she believed it would survive if it could get through the next 24 hours. Marvin exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, though the fear didn't fully leave his chest. He stammered that he'd pay anything it took, even as panic flared about money he didn't have. Dr. Perez squeezed his arm, assuring him there were charities and funds for cases like this, kindness shining in her voice. Marvin's eyes filled again, both gratitude and helplessness churning inside him like a storm. He wanted to believe in miracles, but life had taught him to expect loss instead. He felt the eyes of strangers on him, as if they could see straight into the aching emptiness he carried. Could a man so broken possibly give this kitten the life it deserved? Marvin stood, needing to move as though stillness might crush him under the weight of memory and fear. He paced the small lobby, barely noticing the curious stares of those waiting with their pets. The receptionist offered him a cup of coffee, which he accepted, though he spilled half of it onto his trembling hands. Outside, rain lashed the glass, streaks like silent tears tracing the window panes. Marvin kept glancing at the swinging door behind the counter, hoping for another update. He remembered nights sitting by his wife's hospital bed, waiting for news he was never ready to hear. A fierce protectiveness burned inside him, stronger than anything he'd felt in years. He thought of how the kitten had looked at him, as though it recognized something in him that even he'd forgotten was there. He clenched his jaw, a silent vow forming in his chest that he wouldn't let this tiny creature down. But could he really open his heart again without risking it shattering all over? Marvin jolted when Dr. Perez appeared once more, wiping her hands on a towel. She said the kitten was stable for now and Marvin could come see it if he wanted. Without a word, he followed her down a bright hallway, each step echoing in the sterile corridor. His breath hitched as he entered a small recovery room filled with hum of machines and the scent of antiseptic. In a clear plastic crate lay the kitten, bandaged and tiny, connected to a line dripping life-saving fluids. Its eyes fluttered open as Marvin approached, blue and shining like fragments of the summer sky. A tiny mew slipped out, so soft it barely made a sound, but it felt like an entire conversation. Marvin reached through the opening to gently stroke the kitten's head, tears slipping silently down his cheeks. He whispered, "I'm not leaving you," as the kitten closed its eyes and leaned into his hand. But could he truly promise forever when life had taught him that forever could vanish in a heartbeat? Marvin left the clinic that night under a sky as black as spilled ink, the streetlights glowing like lonely stars, his breath visible in the cool night air. Every footstep echoed against rain-slick sidewalks, a hollow sound that matched the emptiness inside his chest. He paused outside a darkened florist shop, staring at faded petals in the display, remembering how his wife used to love fresh lilies in the house. For the first time in years, he wished he could talk to her, ask her what to do, hear her soft laughter that once soothed all his fears. He found himself speaking to the darkness, telling her about the kitten, about the way its tiny body felt in his hands, warm and trembling. He whispered how its eyes had stared at him like he was someone worth saving, someone who mattered. The city moved on around him, cars rushing by, strangers oblivious to the quiet battle inside the old man in the rain. Marvin clenched his fists in his coat pockets, feeling torn between hope and the ache of old wounds. He felt foolish for caring so deeply about a creature he'd known for mere hours. Yet deep down he wondered, could this be the miracle he'd stopped believing in? At dawn, Marvin returned to the clinic, sleepless and driven by a need he couldn't explain, as though the kitten's heartbeat had become tied to his own. The receptionist looked surprised to see him so early, dark circles under her eyes matching his own exhaustion. Dr. Perez welcomed him with a soft smile, leading him into the quiet back rooms that smelled of warm fur and antiseptic. There, under a heat lamp, lay the kitten, smaller than ever, its tiny chest lifting and falling with each precious breath. Marvin approached slowly, afraid to hope too much, afraid to lose again. He reached into the enclosure, his fingers trembling as they brushed soft white fur. The kitten opened its blue eyes and let out a delicate, scratchy mew that shattered something inside Marvin's chest. He felt tears prickling as the kitten tried to lift its head, fighting exhaustion with stubborn spirit. He whispered, "Hey there, little one, you're tougher than I am, you know that?" Could this fragile creature be the spark that rekindled all the light he'd let fade away? Dr. Perez explained that the kitten would be ready to leave the clinic soon, but would need medication, careful monitoring, and lots of gentle care. Marvin's heart twisted as fear rose up like a tide, filling his chest with doubts he couldn't shake. Could he truly take responsibility for a creature so helpless and injured? He pictured sleepless nights, vet bills, and the ache of attachment that could break his heart all over again. He told Dr. Perez he didn't know if he was strong enough anymore, his voice shaking like brittle glass. She placed a hand on his shoulder, telling him softly that sometimes caring for another soul is what saves us. Marvin stared at the kitten, remembering the warmth of its tiny body pressed to his chest. A whisper of his wife's voice floated through his mind, urging him to be brave. A spark of determination ignited in his weary eyes as he realized he couldn't turn his back on this second chance. But would he have the courage to follow through when the past still haunted his every step? Marvin found himself signing adoption papers with a hand that trembled so badly he could hardly hold the pen. Each signature felt like a vow, binding him to a life he hadn't imagined wanting again. The receptionist beamed at him, wiping tears from her eyes as she handed him a small cardboard carrier lined with a soft towel. Dr. Perez gently placed the kitten inside, whispering to Marvin that the little one would need love, patience, and a safe place to heal. Marvin stared down into the carrier as two sapphire eyes blinked up at him, trusting and vulnerable. People in the waiting room paused to watch, their faces softening with emotion, as though witnessing something sacred. Marvin's throat closed up as he realized how desperately he wanted to protect this fragile life. He cradled the carrier to his chest, feeling a flicker of purpose that felt both terrifying and exhilarating. He whispered, "I guess it's you and me now, kiddo," his voice husky with unshed tears. Could this be the moment when his story and the kitten's began all over again? Marvin stepped outside, the morning air crisp and cool, sunlight breaking through clouds like hope spilling into a dark room. Cars rolled past, people bustled by, but he felt as though the world had paused just for him and the tiny creature he held. He opened the carrier a crack, peeking inside to see the kitten blinking back at him, tiny paws pressing against the cardboard wall. Marvin's heart swelled, a fragile joy blooming in the ruins of his grief. He imagined his wife smiling somewhere unseen, proud of him for daring to love again. 1,000 doubts still gnawed at his mind. Would he be enough? Would the kitten truly heal? Would his own heart survive the risk? Yet beneath the fear, a quiet certainty settled in his chest, like a gentle weight. He glanced down and murmured, "We're going to be okay, I promise." And as he turned toward home, the sun rose higher, spilling golden light across the sidewalk. But would home ever feel like home again without his wife's laughter echoing through its rooms? Marvin named the kitten Lucky, because that's what the little creature felt like, a tiny spark of hope pulled from the jaws of despair. Lucky quickly learned that Marvin's lap was the safest place in the world, curling up there whenever the old man sat down, purring loud enough to drown out the silence of the house. Each day Marvin discovered new reasons to smile, even over small things like Lucky's clumsy leaps off the couch or the way he batted at sunbeams on the floor. Neighbors who'd barely spoken to Marvin in years now stopped by just to see the kitten, charmed by those vivid blue eyes and soft white fur. Marvin told the story so many times that he lost count, each retelling reminding him of the day he'd caught Lucky from the air like a miracle falling from the sky. He found himself laughing again, a sound that felt rusty but wonderful, echoing through rooms that had been silent for far too long. Lucky's presence filled the house with gentle chaos, spilled water bowls, shredded toilet paper, and tiny paw prints tracking dust across polished floors. And Marvin cherished every bit of it, because for the first time in years, life felt like it had color again. He sometimes woke at night in a panic, fearing he'd only dreamed it all, until a small warm weight curled up beside him reassured him it was real. Could one small creature truly bring back a man's reason to live? One afternoon, Marvin sat in his living room, sunshine spilling over the photographs of his wedding day arranged carefully on a side table. Lucky leapt into his lap and pawed gently at the gold wedding band Marvin still wore, tiny claws catching the light. Marvin looked down into those blue eyes and felt tears sting his own, remembering the way his wife had always believed in second chances. He whispered, "She would have loved you, Lucky. She really would have." Lucky tilted his head, as though trying to understand, and pressed his pink nose against Marvin's hand. It felt like a silent promise between them, that neither of them would ever be alone again. Marvin rubbed a finger along Lucky's tiny ear, marveling at how soft and warm it felt. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, carrying the scent of summer flowers through the open window. Marvin breathed it in, feeling something like peace for the first time in years. Yet deep inside he wondered, was it truly possible to start over at his age? Lucky became a small celebrity on Marvin Street, drawing smiles from strangers who'd once hurried past him without a second glance. People brought treats, toys, and blankets, eager to help the kitten who'd survived such cruelty. Marvin found himself telling Lucky's story in the grocery store, at the post office, even to the mailman who used to barely wave. Every time he spoke the words, he felt his own heart stitching itself back together, one fragile thread at a time. He realized that saving Lucky hadn't just given the kitten a second chance, it had given him one too. Each day he discovered moments of unexpected joy, like the way Lucky's tail curled into a question mark when he was curious, or how he purred so loudly that Marvin sometimes couldn't hear the television. At night, Marvin would sit in his recliner, Lucky curled against his chest, feeling as though he could finally breathe again. He often whispered, "Thank you," to the darkness, not even sure who he was thanking anymore. But wasn't it true that the smallest lives often bring the biggest miracles? Marvin and Lucky developed their own quiet routines, from morning meals to cozy evenings watching the sun sink behind rooftops. Lucky would chase crumpled paper balls across the floor until he collapsed, exhausted and content. Marvin sometimes caught himself singing softly, his voice rough but full of tenderness he thought he'd lost forever. Neighbors commented that Marvin seemed younger somehow, as though the kitten had shaved years off his spirit. He started attending local community events again, always with Lucky nestled in a small pet carrier by his side. Strangers stopped him to hear the story of the man who'd caught a kitten falling from the sky. Marvin found that the more he shared his story, the lighter his grief became, piece by piece. He realized his wife would have wanted this for him, to live, to love, to keep his heart open. Lucky had given him that gift, and Marvin couldn't imagine life without him now. But how do you ever repay a creature who saved your soul without even knowing it? One evening, Marvin stood in the doorway of his living room, watching Lucky stretch out in a patch of golden sunlight. He thought of the day he'd caught the tiny kitten falling through the air, a life thrown away by cruel hands, but caught by his own trembling ones. He thought of how close he'd come to giving up on life entirely, and how a fragile creature had turned everything around. Lucky yawned, blinking up at Marvin with eyes as blue as summer skies, and let out a small, inquisitive chirp. Marvin chuckled softly, kneeling to scratch Lucky's chin as the kitten leaned into his touch. He whispered, "We're both lucky, aren't we, little one? You saved me as much as I saved you." A warm breeze drifted through the open window, carrying the scent of blooming roses into the room. Marvin closed his eyes, feeling his heart lighter than it had in years, as though something broken had finally mended. He knew his grief would always be part of him, but so would this new hope shining like sunlight on fur. Because sometimes the most unexpected miracles come wrapped in tiny paws and change your life forever.